Okay, so Catherine, I've followed you and seen you on Instagram and seen the podcast, but we've never met properly, have we? So it's nice to meet properly.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, Vicki. I'm excited to be here.
So this is going to go out, I think, on both our podcasts and YouTube's. I've never recorded a podcast before and then put it on YouTube. So I hope the two faces go next to each other and not like my face on the whole screen, but we'll see. But for, I guess, people who might follow me and not know you or want to know a little bit more about you, do you want to do your own little introduction?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Catherine Moore. I am an LCSW based out of California in the United States. And I've been practicing social work since I got my bachelor's in social work in 2009. So it has been a while. I graduated during the last recession and it was terrible. But I learned a lot of really great skills as far as, what not to do when job hunting and have just come a long way. Now I do have the Social Workers Rise podcast. I also have the Rise directory for clinical supervision. And I will be a published author coming up next year. So that's exciting. And currently, I just do mostly telehealth right now. And I do public speaking engagements and, of course, the podcast.
That's amazing. And I guess for everyone who might be listening on yours, I'm Vicki Shevlin. So I am a social worker in the UK, based in the north of England. I graduated from a master's in 2015 and I worked in local authority child protection here in England as a social worker, a senior social worker, and then I was a child protection conference chair, which is I guess for people across the pond, when we have child protection plans in place, a conference chair would be the person that oversees that and chairs and facilitates the child protection conferences. And then I started Social Work Sorted, how long ago now? In 2021, off the back of COVID, really, for newly qualified social workers who perhaps didn't get the practice placement experience that I got. Everything was virtual, everything moved online. Things were changing in terms of the systems around social workers, and I started an Instagram account. People started to really connect with some of the things that I was sharing, more so around the how-to element of, what do you do in a home visit? Where do you sit? Do you take your shoes off? How do you chair a meeting? That grew and grew. And yeah, last year, even though it was like a week ago, was the first year of me solely doing Social Work Sorted and dedicating all my time to that.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, it's been a year.
Yeah. So what services, like how do you help people through social work sorted in addition to the podcast?
So I have a number of free resources. So again, all across Instagram, I have a mailing list. People can access that for free. And then I started off running masterclasses. So 45-minute to an hour long sessions online on topics like managing meetings or home visits or undertaking assessments. And I now run all my masterclasses inside a membership. So my membership's called The Collective, and it's a growing library of resources, but it's like a one-stop shop for newly qualified social workers and also students on placement. So once they subscribe, it's like a monthly rolling subscription. Once they subscribe, they can go and tap into bite-sized resources that are all relevant to practice. So kind of law, legislation, genograms, different kind of processes and policies that we would have in child protection. And then I also have a introduction to assessment course. So there's a specific kind of assessment that we would do in England. And that's kind of branching out now to kind of working with universities to do some online masterclasses and CPD accredited training. So yeah, lots of things.
Awesome. Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. Such great resources. I found the same on my end that when I started Social Workers Rise, there was such a need for this information and guidance and just, like a distant mentorship type of relationship with my listeners. And so from that, I started a similar program. So I think this is neat across the board, the Clinical Essentials for the Future Therapist, which is based, on social work here in the United States, but it's a very broad overview around the foundational skills of social work, right? So how to do a proper assessment, how to document your interventions, even when it feels like you're not really doing anything. You, in fact, are doing very, very powerful work. How to utilize CBT, safety planning, termination, using mindfulness. So a whole slew of different things are included in this course. And there's been a really, really high need and a lot of great feedback from it. So I've just noticed, the conversations coming out among new social workers that they just don't feel prepared and they don't feel like they have the right training. I don't know if you've noticed that on your side of the pond.
Yeah, and we've got different, I know it's so different because you would maybe say like some social workers are therapists, whereas in England you have to be qualified in a different way to be a therapist. But we now have different access routes into social work. So you can do a degree, which I guess would be like a traditional access route, so an undergraduate or a master's degree. But we also have apprenticeships, so you sort of work on the job to get your qualification. There are also, and that's going to grow a little bit more in England. We also have people refer to them as fast track programs. Again, they're sort of work on the job and they are over like 1 or 2 years. So the entry route is really varied. So a lot of people will say, I'm not prepared. But now so many people come into social work in different ways in England, and like the political landscape is how can I say? The political landscape is obviously impacting training and how that runs. So it's really difficult to prepare social workers. And then we have the added layer of, how much can you be prepared for a job when you are doing you're getting a generic qualification. If you're getting that generic qualification and you're getting it in the form of a degree, you might not feel prepared when you go into children's services because your degree wasn't to be a children's social worker. It was a generic social work degree. And that's the fast track programs are very focused on one area of social work. So we have a fast track program which is around just working with children. And so people may feel more prepared with that. I mean, I get people from across the board who access social work sorted. So I don't think one is better than the other, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's not like it's never just straightforward. It's not like you qualify and then that's it. And I guess that's social work, isn't it? It's so varied. I don't know what you find, because I know I really try and understand the way social work functions, because I guess you would have like child welfare social workers, and then you might have like private social workers or like clinical social workers.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear your route to being a social worker, that there's so many different routes. For us in the United States, generally it's one route. So you get your degree in social work or related field. It just depends on the state that you're in. Some states have title protection where you can't call yourself a social worker unless you have a social work degree, but not all states. So essentially you get a degree and then you can start either like working as a social worker. You can choose to get licensed as a social worker, which is a whole another process of thousands of hours of being supervised by a licensed professional. And then there's drama with the clinical tests that we have to take. So at the end of your licensing hours, you have to take this national clinical test, which they released data last year is racially biased. So now there's this question about, okay, are we, banning people from or preventing people from entering the field? Are we, not making it as diverse? Are we putting up more challenges than necessary? So there's this whole conversation around what does this look like and what other ways can we do this without a test that's racially biased, racially and age-based biased, I'll be fair. And
Yeah.
so back to your question, with the general degree, you can be a child protection social worker, and you can also do a lot of other jobs because it's a generalist degree. Some colleges have like specialties like macro or clinical, but for the most part, it's a general, and you can do pretty much anything with it. So you can work with children, you can work with homeless, you can work with substance abuse, you can work with human trafficking, you can do medical social work. So it really provides the basis for a lot of those different areas here in the United States.
Okay. Yeah, ours is, I guess I get a lot of new social workers who, because we have something called the ASYE, so it's the Assessed and Supported Year in Employment. So a lot of, once you first qualify, you're expected to complete that assessed and supported year in employment, which means obviously you're being assessed throughout the year. And it looks different based on where you work, based on the location. But some places that aren't local authority, so I guess that'd be equivalent to like the state, don't offer that or don't have the capacity to offer that. So I find a lot of students and new social workers feel quite trapped by it, that they only can go through working with a local authority to almost get that ASYE, and then the doors open up a little bit more. And I don't know, is there an equivalent, or would you say that's probably like the licensing process?
Yeah, the licensing process. Once you have your license, the doors open up and you can pretty much do anything, qualify for any job.
Oh wow. Yeah,
Mhm.
who did I speak to? She runs this like the social work bub or social work bubble account. And like I went on
Oh,
her.
Laura.
Yeah, and we
Uh-huh.
were talking about that, and it felt at the time like there were so many more opportunities in the US, but maybe that's just like my perception of it, or because social work is so different, I guess.
Yeah, it is different. I know there are a lot of opportunities. The I give a handout, like a freebie of 200 social work jobs that you can do with a master's. And that's
Mm.
very popular. And there's just, like I said, across the board. So then in the UK, does that mean you're pretty much limited to child protection?
It doesn't mean you're limited to child protection. It means that for a lot of the time, to do your ASYE, you need to work in a local authority, and our local authorities would cover children's services and adult services. So children's services, a lot of that is either early intervention assessment, child protection, care proceedings, fostering, adoption. Adults, maybe mental health, or it might be older adults working in hospitals or discharge teams. So there's still loads of opportunities,
Sure.
but there's almost this narrative that child protection is like a rite of passage. And I don't think it's really a big thing that's spoken about, but I know a lot of new social workers who I'm in touch with feel that they sort of have to do it to prove that
Mhm.
they can do it or prove that they can't. And then when they don't like it or it's not for them, they feel this massive sense of failure, when in actual fact it's just not for everybody. And there's almost this thing of, sometimes it's sort of the superhero idea of, oh, I've done this long in child protection, and kind of wearing it like a badge. That's like more like informal conversations, I would say. So it's interesting. So child protection isn't the only option, but I sometimes, and again, the feedback I get from people is that they feel that that is all that's talked about. And on the flip side, that is all I talk about, because that's what I do. And I've always worked in children's services. That's my bread and butter. But I'm mindful that it isn't for everybody. And I would never want my account to make people think that they don't have other options as well. So I'm quite clear, like talking about that. But yeah, that's what I do. And they're the social workers that I work with, I suppose.
Okay. So then there's a different route if you wanted to be a therapist. Is that right? Like you can't just go and get hired as a therapist somewhere?
No. So it would depend in terms of so for example, if I wanted to go into family therapy, that would be a separate qualification. So I would do like, I once worked for a local authority where I did like a foundation course in systemic family therapy, but I'm not then qualified to say I'm a therapist. So I can use some of the principles of that in the work that I do. And a lot of local authorities do that. But to then go on and be a qualified family therapist, I would have to do another qualification, so equivalent to a degree. And again, it would depend on the type of therapist you can get into. So it leaves social
Okay.
workers in children's services, because that's what I know. It sometimes leaves them a little bit like, well, what am I then? Because
Yeah.
I'm not a therapist, and I'm not. I might be doing things that are inspired by therapy, and like play therapy and drama therapy and
Yep.
everything, but there's this kind of identity anyway. It is so driven by policy and legislation and procedure, it you can really you can get carried away with it, that you just feel like you're almost on a bit of a hamster wheel, which isn't the case. And social workers have so much potential to do that intervention. But yeah, when it comes to the labels and the jobs and what we do, it's not clear, which can be quite hard.
Okay.
I know. Do
Yeah.
you think that's easier then in the US, that those labels effectively are a little bit clearer?
Yes and no. So I say no just because they're so broad and so general, right? So a lot of people don't know that social workers are therapists. Even my own family, they're like, I thought you were a social worker. I didn't know you did therapy. I said, okay, well, yeah. We can do both here in the United States. And so, especially once you're licensed, you can apply to any therapy job. Like
Okay.
you're considered a therapist basically once you're licensed. And you can work for therapy before if you're an associate or in training or in supervision. And there are places that can hire you. But I know after you get licensed, if you're on LinkedIn, they just flood your inbox with, come please work for us, because they're always looking for
Wow.
licensed individuals. Yeah. Yeah.
And that would be that anybody who needs therapy would look for that. Like, it would be any company, any organization.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's been a lot of there's if you're looking for a fast job and you're licensed, you can just go to the big mental health companies and they'll hire you right away.
And what does that look like then ethically? Like, with, do you know, like, how would a social worker, if I was in America and where, well, actually, my first question is, what do you have to do to get licensed? But if I did and I got licensed, when we have our like social work values, and we have like, if the International Federation of Social Workers, how do you then manage that in
It's
terms of
very it's
company that you
very
do it for?
it's very sketchy, Vicki. It can be
Yeah,
very sketchy because it's left up to each individual's own judgment of their skills and their expertise. And when signing up for these companies, or really any therapy companies, you can just check a box and say, I want to work with them and them and them and them. And you don't have to prove that you have any sort of competence or experience
okay.
working with them. So that's the part that it's really left up to the individual, and it can be harmful for the clients, because if I say I work with children and I never have in fact done therapy with children, then I'm essentially just, showing up as another bad therapist who's not helping their kid, and it gives them a really, poor experience of the therapy process. So yeah, it's pretty sketch.
Yeah. And how is that then managed? Do you know? So it's like, when you're licensed, do you have to have supervision, for example?
No,
No.
no. So
Oh,
once
right.
you're licensed, you don't need to have any supervision. You're just off in the wild, off on your own if you choose to be. And that's what a lot of people choose to do. And you can, it is encouraged, of course, to consult on challenging cases, or if you're
Yeah, yeah.
practicing a new therapy modality, to consult with people around that. But there's no oversight, really. There's no boss, you know, looking over your shoulder, especially with these big companies. They just want
Yeah.
to see that you're doing the hours and you're doing your
Oh,
notes, and that's it.
that's interesting. So is there anything to like combat that? Do you know what I mean? Like, obviously there must be social workers who are doing that ethically, like you, like mindful of the fact that it's really sketchy. So like, what's happening to, yeah, challenge it, if anything?
I haven't heard of anything. That doesn't mean that there's not. I haven't
Mm,
heard of anything. What I've heard is that you tell clients that if they have a complaint or anything like that, then here's the number to the state agency. That's in California. I don't know
okay.
about other states.
Oh
Yeah.
wow, that's so
Yeah.
interesting.
It is interesting. And they say, there's just a whole mental health crisis that we need all of these clinicians. And so because there's such a dire need for mental health support, I think that the standards that they're really looking to hire people go down.
Yeah.
Which is good and bad, right? Pros and cons.
Yeah, I guess there's more people out there, but then it's just more risk, or like if there's no, because we would have, I mean, supervision can be really sketchy in local authorities because people, the bad version of supervision is, tick box, have you done this by this time? Have you seen this person? And no reflection and no like critique.
Mm-hmm.
And in really struggling local authorities, you might not have supervision every 4 weeks like you're supposed to.
Oh, that's different.
What, that you're supposed to have it a certain amount?
So every 4 weeks sounds like a little bit of time to me. Because here
I,
in my state, we have it's required to do 1 to 2 hours. So if you have more than 10 hours of face-to-face patient clinical time, then you have to do 2 hours every week.
right, okay. Yeah, so I would say it's every 4 weeks. I think when you're an ASYE, you're supposed to have it every other week, so like every
Okay.
2 weeks. But yeah, as a social worker, I would have an hour, 2 hours every 4 weeks, and that could be to talk about 30 families in that time.
That's
So it
not a
isn't
lot.
not a lot, especially when you do then have those, time scales, time frames. Have you done this? Have you done that? If there's one family where things are, you're really struggling, you could be talking about that for 40 minutes. Then you've got all the other families to have
Yep.
that. So it's hard as a social worker, it's hard as a manager then to have oversight of everybody. But yeah, that's one of the things that really people find hard. I did work in a local authority which was very systemic, where every week we had, it was always a Tuesday morning. It was like 4 hours, and the whole team we had a team supervision. So
Okay.
everybody knew everyone's families, and you could talk about that, you could share ideas, and we also had our individual supervision as well. But I just felt really held then, and I kind of knew I had that safety of every Tuesday morning. It was okay, everything was blocked out. I was going to have my cup of tea, my biscuits, and we were going to be able to talk about things. So I think, there are models where that does happen a little bit more often. And that was definitely, I mean, that was a great local authority that I worked in. But again, it massively depends on where you are, the funding that you get, the manager that you have. All those things are kind of really interchangeable, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just amazing the different trainings that social workers get, within one country, but especially across the world, that it's really not the same. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get people from other countries, and a lot of social workers in Africa reach out to me, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about social work in Africa um,
Yeah.
and India, and I'm like, I can't help you. I'm sorry, I'm not the one. So I don't know if you get people reaching out from other places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, even when I get social workers from Scotland and Wales, some of them are part of my membership, but I have to be really clear that like the legislation and the law is different, and I will only ever teach what I know, and I won't go beyond that. So even like adult services in England, I'm not going to be talking about that because it's not what I know, it's not my area of expertise. And
Right.
I think I'm really interested in international social work and how that functions. And I met, so it was last year now, I wanted to say this year, social workers in Singapore and Malaysia, and it was just really interesting learning about the difference. And actually today I've done a podcast interview with a social worker who an English social worker but who worked in Palestine, and really thinking about the differences in what social work looks like. And it feels like in some places it's much more community based, which is what
Okay.
I think social work is and should be, rather than these processes and procedures and risk aversion and capitalism. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, and I'm interested in thinking about it more. That's which has probably increased over the past year or so in terms of what that looks like and what we can learn. Because I definitely found when I was talking to, it was lecturers in Malaysia, but they were talking to me about the policy, and a lot of the policy is based on UK policy and legislation. just not the best blueprint, and it just it kind of like reeks of those ideas of like colonialism and it not being applicable to, you know, people living, you know,
Like
in
real
whatever
people.
country it is that are taking that. Yeah. So I'm interested in how that they get formed or how policy is shaped really. But yeah, I get
Yeah.
people contacting me for it's crazy. But the podcast, I guess yours reaches as well. I think my podcast goes to like 50 people listening in 50 countries, which I
Yep.
reckon yours must be more than that. Which I just think, and some of it is obviously because what we're talking about is applicable wherever you are.
Yep.
So that's quite nice. But yeah, some of the times I'm just like, I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. 60 countries, very similar to yours. And it's just, it's really fascinating to see the differences. So I'm glad that we were able to kind of dissect today the differences between United States social work and UK social work. And it's just an overview. Of course, we can't cover everything, but it's a good starting point.
Yeah, and it's obviously all my opinion as well because the roots into social work, it's there's lots of like contentious issues around that. So, but yeah, if people are interested, they can contact me and I can send them some writing about it because it is an interesting one. But so
Yeah.
for you, obviously having a podcast, I'm really interested because I have a podcast. Like, what made you start it, and why do you think it's grown so much? And how long ago did you start it?
Yeah, great question. So I started it in January of 2020, and it came from a place of burnout because I was at a place in 2019. I had got licensed and I thought my world was going to change when I got licensed. And I didn't get a raise. I got more money and I got burnt out. And I like just had this meltdown, if you will. Like, is this what I signed up for? And so I I knew I didn't want to do video. I mean, God bless you for doing video because that's just not my jam. I try it. It's a work in progress. But
Yeah,
I just started with what was easily accessible. And I had listened to podcasts before and I thought, I could do this. I could get on there and start talking about all the things that I'm, essentially mad about. And it
yeah,
was really, and it's not coming from a place of anger. I was really coming to the podcast from a place of, one, I want to be entertaining because I want people to be excited to listen and also learn from it, right? So, education and entertainment are my two pillars. And I think that's really why people continue to listen
mm.
because we want to hear about these topics, right? But we also don't want to fall asleep on our drive to work.
That's so
And yeah, and these are interesting stories, right? So I thought, I can definitely be more entertaining than a lot of the other social work podcasts that are currently released. You weren't out at the time, so I'm not talking about
no,
your podcast. And I just wanted to change the narratives, right? I wanted to change that toxic narrative around you should just expect to be burnt out because that's essentially what people told
mm,
me, right? If I was struggling and I opened up about it, they say, well, you're in social work. What do you expect? And I
yeah,
thought that was some BS. That I was not okay with this narrative because social workers are the most caring and giving people that I know on the planet. And I thought that was some BS to tell all of these kind-hearted people just expect to be burnt out.
yeah,
And then also to just expect to not make any money, to be broke. So we're just expected to be broke with all of these student loans and feel burnt out. That sounds miserable, Vicki. That is not what I am here for. That is
yeah,
not the life that I'm trying to live. And so I just started with what was simplest. I hit record and started bringing on social workers to share their stories. And that's what it's grown into. People love hearing from other social workers around the work that they do and the differences in the stories. And I've had people reach out to me say, I listened to this podcast and I went in for the interview and I got the job because I felt so well prepared after listening. And or I quit my job because you inspired me to not feel burnt out anymore, to not take this toxic workplace anymore. And these stories, they're just beautiful. And I just love it.
oh, that's so nice. Yeah, it's my absolute favorite thing to do ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So what inspired you?
I think my brother has a podcast, so he's a personal trainer. He's not a social worker, but he sort of went self-employed and started a podcast. And then when I was like years before, I was doing like social work sorted, and then I think because I was on Instagram and started to realize what people were finding helpful, there's almost like there's only so much that you could fit in a square. And it was before, like, I don't even think there was that many like videos and stuff on Instagram at the time. It was literally like 2 years ago, but obviously the nature of social media changes. So I was the same. I just wanted to, I suppose, give a bit more of an in-depth how to. So it started with like how to do a home visit and the stages of that. And I was like, maybe recording it is the best way. And although we're doing video now, I was like, well, if I can, I've got 2 little boys, so I needed to be able to do something at the end of the day because I was still working full time when they were asleep. They don't really sleep very well, but for like the 2 hours I would get in the evening before they woke up, and yeah, not feel the pressure to be like ready to go on the camera or have anything like a tidy house behind me. So yeah, it just works. And then someone reached out to me, Jo Schofield. So she's on Instagram as immigration social workers. So she does loads around working with immigration, with social work. She was like, oh, if you have guests on the podcast, I'd love to come on. And then I was like, oh yeah, I could have guests on. And I've just, honestly, it's been so lovely because I get to talk to people that I'm really interested in and just have a conversation like I would have anyway. But it obviously benefits people as well because I get to share that, and new social workers learn a lot. And then the more the podcast grows, the more there's still some people who I'm like, oh, like, I'm too nervous to ask you to come on the podcast, even though no one's ever said no way or like,
Right.
you're horrible, I'm not going to come on. But yeah, there's still some people that I feel like probably like starstruck, but they're not like famous people. But yeah, it's been really nice. I really like it. So I'd probably do, I think, like you, a mix. Sometimes it's just me and they'll be like 10-15 minutes because again, I just don't want people to fall asleep, or they're a bit longer because I'm having a chat with somebody, and that's it. I don't know, it's easier to listen for longer when it's 2 people talking, I think.
Definitely.
But it's good. And because when I joined Instagram, there were loads of US accounts, and it seemed like it was quite an established thing, whereas there weren't as many UK social work accounts. Whereas
Yep.
now, what, 2 years on, it's completely different. And I think it's nice when we can, as long as we are kind of being safe, and especially in England, like we have a code of ethics and
Yep.
that we have to follow. But as long as we're doing that and sharing safely, I think it's a really good thing to try and change some of the narratives about social work. And also
Yeah. Yeah.
conversations like this as well, so people can learn about different countries and stuff.
Yep. Yep. And the beautiful thing about podcasts is that these are uncensored and these are real conversations from real social workers and not from the people up top who aren't even working in the field. Right. So
Mhm.
they're uncensored, they're timely. And I've even had a lot of people reach out to me say that my podcast was an assignment in their class, in their college
Oh,
course.
amazing.
Yeah, and so they would listen to it and talk about it. And so there's just so many different ways to use these different media platforms to expand the learning of traditional social work education.
Yeah, I definitely think more. I did collaborated with a trust. So a trust would be like, I suppose the equivalent would be like if a few states came together and
Okay.
formed sort of where it's like the
Okay.
police, healthcare, social work. So a trust would kind of oversee a number of areas. But they were developing a program for senior practitioners, and they wanted a podcast to kind of accompany the program. So I worked with them to do that, and I think more local authorities here are now developing their own podcasts because it is such a good way to connect with people, and social workers who are out in the community and are driving here to there. They might listen to it in the car. It makes it more accessible. So I definitely think it will just grow as people realize the value of, and I wish more local authorities would do it. And I think I guess the uncensored part of me and you being able to talk means people can relate to us and connect to us. And I think, well, maybe if more people in senior positions did that, and you don't have to like say things that are controversial or swear or whatever to be
Right.
personable and uncensored. But I just think it's, in England anyway, where we have this massive disconnect between people who are on the ground working and people who are heads of service, I just think it's like a no-brainer way of that connection and getting to know somebody. So yeah, hopefully that grows, I think. Hopefully. But I love
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I've had the podcast has just opened up so many doors. So if anyone listening has thought about starting your own podcast, just know you're going to be in it for the long haul. This isn't going to happen
yeah,
in 10 episodes, but if it's something that you're really passionate about having these conversations, it can open up so many doors. I mean, I've talked to, like you said, kind of big people, starstruck people that I have no business talking to because I am just a regular social worker. But when you say, oh, I have a podcast, people are immediately interested and they're like, oh, well, tell me more. I want to, talk about myself. So it's definitely powerful.
yeah. I like how you said about the time as well, because I think when you were saying oh, it's listened to in 53 countries or this many downloads or whatever, that's obviously over like 2 or 3 years. And I
Yes.
always think that's really important to share as well. And I think it's more important now that I am self-employed rather than when I was working full time, that it's still really hard and I wouldn't rather be doing anything else. But I think even I had a perception of it was going to be easier, and it's definitely harder, and that's okay. But I like to share the reality of it as well, because having like committing to doing a podcast every single week, like there've been times where there's been massive gaps because I just haven't been able to do it when I
Yep.
was working full time, or sometimes I'll record and then it will take me a while to then edit it. So I know, like I said, I wouldn't have it any other way, but it is a big commitment, isn't it? And I think more and more people in England are looking at being a social worker in a different way, and I think that's amazing. But I always like to be like the reality of it, of like doing something that is rooted in social media and working online. It's so time heavy, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, because you see what, a minute reel, but that minute reel takes you an hour or
Oh, yeah.
more to create and record, and it's a lot. So it's worth it, but it is a lot. And I think too, I've had to find that balance, right? Because I got
Mm,
burnt out on doing podcast episodes. And so I just found that a season of 12 episodes is kind of perfect for me to be
yeah.
able to record and come up with content ideas. And then I'll take a break, usually for a month or so, and then restart it up. And so that's been what's helping me to keep it sustainable.
Yeah, that's a good idea actually. I think it all translates to social work as well, doesn't it? Because it's just about like knowing your limits, knowing what
Yep.
you can input, knowing what you need to have that balance of it, and taking pressure off what you don't need to take pressure off. And yeah, I found that in working in this way. We weren't even supposed to talk about this, but I'm on a tangent now. But I found like working in this way, I'm taking so much from my social work training
Yep.
into it, and also having to remember that as well, because I'm like, just because you work in a different way or work flexibly doesn't mean you've got to like stop looking after yourself or go to bed late or whatever it is. So yeah, I think those like foundations of looking after yourself need to be there all the time, don't they?
Yes, yes, because there's always going to be people who need your help, but that
Mm.
doesn't mean that you always have to be available to help them.
Yeah, that's so true. That's like I've like my new year, I've got an out of office on anyway now, but I'm trying to like redirect people away from social media. So I'm like, email me instead of a DM, because if I miss that, then you're going to think that I've just ignored you when actually I just haven't got capacity. Or if I go on Instagram, I'll get sucked in and I'll be scrolling, and I don't want to do that either. So I have to like, yeah, there's a few things that I'm having to put in place this year to just be a little bit more like disciplined with myself, I suppose.
Yes, yes, for sure. Me too, Vicki.
So I'm really mindful of your time, but I just wanted to ask before we finish, what is, if there's one thing, there might be more, one thing that you are excited about for social work? So we often frame things in like, what's the biggest challenge or what's going wrong? And we know them, but what kind of makes you excited for social work or social workers this year?
I'm excited for I feel like this sounds so corny, but like for the next generation, for the students that are currently being taught right now and coming new into the field, because it's such a breath of fresh air around topics that we're talking about, right? Balance, pay equity, and also not feeling burnt out and feeling valued on the job. So these are all the conversations that I'm hearing. And it's such a 180 from where I came from. I mean, when I was going to school in the 2000s, and then, I graduated in 2015, that was not the case, right? The narrative was exactly what I talked about before, but now it's flipped and we're demanding more, which is pissing people off. But I think that's great because we're never going to have pay equity or be able to do the self-care that we need or take the mental health breaks that we need if we don't ask for it. And more than ask for it, if we don't demand it, because it's all about the money and people are going to pay us as little as possible that they can. And if they think that we're going to work for crumbs, then they're going to offer us crumbs.
Yeah.
But as a profession, when we demand more, that's when the people with the money are like, okay, fine, we'll give them we'll give them more. They actually do important work, so we'll give them more. So that's what I'm excited about, is just this change in the narrative. What about you?
Yeah, mine's probably similar, I would say, in terms of like the capacity for, and I guess I can only really speak for England and where I'm connecting with people, but I suppose the capacity for social workers to demand more, whether it's more for the people that they work with or more for them. And I suppose a rise in that advocacy and activism and being more like, you can't get away from the fact that social work is political. So, more political activism and trying to work within that. And it's a hard thing to do, especially when you work in local authority, especially when you're a new social worker. But just sort of, there's a bit of a rise in that. And I guess I'm excited for a rise in social workers having a bit of a voice, which again might sound like cliche, but especially in England, we're often not even on the agenda. So rather than it being a negative thing, because there's this big kind of conversation about negative stereotypes of social workers, I actually think we're not even on the agenda. So when there are political conversations about public services, it might be the police, firefighters, medical, social workers, and it's almost silent.
Yep.
Rather than that we're there. So hopefully just more of us being on the agenda. And then also there's a bigger wave of like parental advocacy, so kind of working within communities and also kind of learning from people with lived experience. And I'm excited for that because I think that's kind of the future, really. I learn more from people with lived experience of social work than from any sort of book or course. So
yeah, for sure.
Lots to be excited. I think it's nice to end on things that we're excited about, because otherwise what's the point?
Yeah,
Like, you need
exactly.
to have that active hope rather than it being this distant thing of like, no, there are good things happening and they can just exist with the bad things. It doesn't negate them, but we end on that because, not going to leave people feeling down in the dumps.
Exactly. I love that. Well, you have inspired me. I hope that anyone listening feels inspired and uplifted too. So thank you so much for talking with me today, Vicki.
Oh, thank you. It's been so nice to connect and nice to like learn and know a bit more about like US social work. So yes, thank you so much.